Hi, I'm Mike Hatzitz from Momentum Investments, and today I'm going to talk about responsible investments, or put it another way, what is the purpose of your investments? More and more we've seen that investors are starting to question not just the return on their investments, but whether the investments themselves are doing good. So that has become a far more core and mainstream concept in investment management. And the tagline for that is responsible investment, or the other name it's known by is environmental, social, and governance. Environmental refers to issues or projects that are beneficial to the environment, or at least don't harm the environment. Social talks to the need to uplift communities and not have a detrimental effect on the labor workforce. And governance talks to the checks and balances that we need to have in place to manage both investments and the organizations or instruments that we invest in. As responsible investment has become more mainstream, we've realized that the most effective way to achieve impact investments or good effect from investments is through an integration approach. And that's what we try to do. And the reason that we think about integration is that the different components of environmental, social, and governance issues do not necessarily always complement each other. So you can have an initiative that has good environmental impact. An example would be the closure of a coal-fired power station, but it would have a significant negative impact on the community that is employed or surrounding that coal-fired power station. So that's a simple example of how we can see that the E, the S, and the G do not always align with each other. So what we've seen through an integration approach is that that's a better way to be able to balance the countervailing forces. Now, a good example of how we think about it and how we have integrated ESG or responsible investment in our portfolios is just to touch on state-owned enterprises and our approach to invest in them. So I think the first point to make is that not all state-owned enterprises can be treated in the same way. SOEs generally play a pivotal, important strategic part in the economy, and practically we cannot have significant failures in state-owned enterprises. The topical example at the moment would be Eskom, which is having challenges with energy production. Now, we do need to support Eskom, and how we've thought about it is to keep the lights on. We need to invest with Eskom, but we're worried about a lot of the issues around governance, controls, audits at Eskom. So where we invest with Eskom, it is into the government guaranteed Eskom debt. Now, why do we do that? Well, clearly, it's a critical imperative to keep the lights on, but we do know that Eskom, as a core coal-fired power station electricity production entity, is not beneficial for the environment. And that brings different elements that we need to consider when we think not just about the Eskom investment, but just what we're trying to achieve holistically in our portfolios. And that brings a few other matters to the fore. The first one is to become more sensitive to climate change. We need to start thinking about renewable energy and investment in renewable energy. So we do have a focus in some of our other portfolios or components of our portfolios where we think about both carbon efficiency and renewable energy, where we've invested of the order of 1.5 billion rand into both solar and wind-powered energy companies or electricity production. Now, that brings another concept to the fore. If you had to suddenly switch off all the coal-fired power stations and coal mines that feed those, there'll be a significantly negative impact on the community surrounding those. Now, how do you balance the need to try and protect the environment with the need that we do need to move to a greener future where renewable energy plays a far more core component in what we want to achieve from an electricity production statement? Earlier this year, we signed on to the Just Transition Statement. Now, the Just Transition is a global standard or global initiative that tries to talk to the need to balance different forces And what the Just Transition Statement says is that when you think about renewable energy and the need for renewable energy, be cognizant of the workers and the communities in which the traditional energy production, in our case coal-fired power stations, are based, and have a keen focus on how do you upskill those workers to be able to participate in different opportunities that come up in the renewable sector space and the ancillary industry. So what we try and do from a just transition is, when we consider both support for what we have currently versus thinking about where we need to move to in the future, we need to be mindful that we need to take the human element into account and support initiatives that talk to both providing greener energy into the future, but also projects that are sensitive to the needs of the communities in which they are placed, and that they do have a key focus on how they can upskill those communities to continue to participate, or to at least start participating in the economy going forward. So that's a key undertaking. And having touched on renewable energy, what also comes into stark focus is the talk around infrastructure investments. Now, infrastructure investments, as you're all aware, is a critical investment for our economy. In May this year, the Presidential Working Group on Infrastructure Investments announced a pipeline of about 350 billion rand worth of infrastructure projects. Now, a lot of those projects are critical and will have significant societal benefit. I've talked a little bit about renewable energy, but there's also a big focus on water infrastructure, which is significantly underserviced in our economy, and we do need to support that. How we've approached this is, within our real asset program, of which infrastructure is a part, we start looking at what are the kinds of real impact investing opportunities that we can take into account and make on behalf of our clients that will give them real economic return on the capital that's invested, and also has beneficial outcomes from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. Within the government's pipeline of infrastructure projects, there's definitely going to be a focus, and we are going to be looking at water and energy projects, and probably some transport projects as well. One of the areas that we're very excited about is the areas of impact investing. And that's represented by a class of investments that are generally termed real assets, where there's a tangible line of sight view of that asset and the impact that can have. Infrastructure is a component of it, but there are other components that we are equally excited by. And the one area that we believe will have a fundamentally positive impact in our society is our student accommodation initiatives that are acutely focused at that body of students that come from underprivileged communities and cannot access good quality, affordable, clean, secure housing. Now, why it's important is there's a critical need, or in terms of education outcomes, having a safe, secure environment is a key driver of successful outcomes for students. And what we've seen is that there's acute shortage of the order of about 300,000 beds a year in the student body coming from lower income communities. So what are we trying to do there? Provide safe, secure accommodation at a price point that is accessible to those students, especially where they access National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And the reason for that is it plugs into an income stream so we can generate a return for our investors, but it also unlocks an environment where those students can access the accommodation to pursue their educational outcomes and really substantively change to the human capital base that we have in the country, and which is critical for the future success of our economy, having well-qualified individuals. Now, the brand that we're building this under is called Rise Student Living, and you're welcome to go look at the website risestudent.living.com, which sort of encapsulate our approach to student housing, and also to try and manage the expense base. It uses a fully digital approach. So the enrollment and the management is very digitized, and we're quite excited by the opportunities that this unlocks for us. Today, I've spent some time talking about how we integrate ESG practices into our investment management, because I truly believe that's the right thing to do. To not just look at the return on your investment, but to also start thinking deeply about what the purpose of that investment is, so that you create a positive environment for your investors into which they will retire one day. Now, how do you practically do this? And you need a framework, and we've got a couple of pillars that we've put in place to enable driving integration of ESG consistently with how we think about investments, as far as it is practically possible, because in some investments you can do more than you can in others, and sometimes you do need to make trade-offs, as I've described, between the E, the S, and the G. So first and foremost, what is very important is that we advocate. We talk openly and proudly of what we're trying to do and achieve from a responsible investment perspective and why we want to do it, because we think it has real tangible benefits for our investors. And we want to encourage yourselves and our other investors and our suppliers to be advocates for responsible investment, because I truly believe that that is the way that you need to think about investment management going into the future. But you can't just advocate it. You also need to hold yourself accountable. And the mechanism by which you do that is to report openly and transparently on what you have achieved and where your challenges still remain. From that perspective, we have full disclosure of what we have achieved, and that's available on our website. And we do encourage our partners and our suppliers and other investments that we make to also disclose their practices and approaches. And we invite you as an investor community to also challenge your investment managers, to challenge yourselves to look at disclosing what you're trying to achieve and that you are looking at the purpose of your investment. Integration is the key fundamental mechanism by which you can really get purpose out of your investments. One of the areas that we also advocate quite extensively, especially when we consider the South African environment, is active ownership. We are not in the fortunate position that we've got an endless array of investment instruments to consider. So if we look at our equity market is quite tightly held, but there is also not a huge number of equity counters that we can invest in. So it's not really that practical, especially when we look at some of the bigger companies listed on the stock exchange, to not invest in those companies. What is a more pragmatic way to achieve progress and to get those companies to think about ESG practices? And that is through the mechanism of active ownership. And that's driving change from within and engaging and saying, this is where we think you should be thinking. And how we do that is through engaging and voting actively on what we want to achieve in our portfolios. At the end of the day, the success of any initiative relies on the integrity that the proponents of that initiative have. And for us, it's key that we hold ourselves accountable and that we practice what we preach. That when we say we're going to drive a certain initiative or take a certain action, that we stick the course and that we have integrity in all we do and we allow ourselves to be held accountable. That's a simple framework, and one that the investor community yourselves can think about as custodians of capital in how can you start applying practically a purpose into your investment portfolios and how do you actualize it. I hope you saw merit in and tangible benefit in driving purpose in your investments through responsible investment practices. And I encourage all of you to take this forward and to engage with each other and with your investment managers and hold us all to account, to practice what we preach and not just deliver a return on your investments, but also demonstrate what the purpose of your investments are. Thank you.